Hello and welcome to another one of our presentations put together by Plymouth County Extension. This one is titled Bad Air, which is where the term malaria comes from, mal air. And our focus today is going to be on mosquitoes. If you haven't been taking part in these webinar series, as a refresher, my name is Blake Dinius, and I work as the Plymouth County Entomologist Extension Educator. Prior to this role, I worked in research. And you can see the kind of research that I used to do. This is a honeybee grafting tool on the left here. And this is what you would use to take honeybees out of the hive and put them into these well plates where you could watch them grow. I also ended up doing work with a number of other insects like ladybugs and lacewings and non-insect species like earthworms and springtails. In my current role, I deliver a lot of education to high schools, to libraries, to senior centers. I even lead outdoor walks or answer questions in person. If you have a question on a type of insect, you want to see that identified, feel free to email me a picture. But you can just think of me as a giant bug nerd. So let's get into the meat of things. What is a mosquito? So a mosquito is in the order Diptera, which means that it has 2 wings. And you can see that, so mosquitoes along with all other flies have 2 wings, and they have these specialized structures that were modified from hindwings called halteres. And that's what these arrows are pointing to, these little knob-like features. And these halteres are what the mosquito uses to help with its evasive and really acrobatic like flight maneuvers. It helps maintain balance inside flight. Mosquitoes are a special group of flies called in the family Culicidae. And you can separate mosquitoes from other groups of flies like your house flies, horse flies, or midges by a few characters. One of the things that mosquitoes possess are scaled wings. And you can see all these little like black little hairs and these fringes along the mosquito's wing. These are what separates the mosquito from other flies. Mosquitoes also have a proboscis or proboscis, depending on how you pronounce it. And this is a really specialized mouth part. You can see that in the image to the left, a typical grasshopper or cricket's mouth might have a labrum, a mandible, maxilla, and a labium. And you can see these kind of shaped on the bottom of this organism. And you can see that those particular mouth parts have now been modified to become very, very thin and very skinny and sharp on the end. The very similar mouth parts like the maxilla or the labium or the labrum and mandible are now these long, sharp, stabby-like mouth parts. So mosquitoes are very careful feeders. They're actually looking to cannulate blood vessels. This is very different than some other blood feeders like ticks. They're quick, they're gonna feed in about minutes. Mosquitoes are very old. The oldest fossils we have of mosquitoes date back to be about 30 or 60 million years ago. But we actually estimate that they're older than birds and mammals about 70 or 230 million years ago. So when you look at this image from Jurassic Park, you can see that Dr. Hammond is holding up a mosquito trapped in amber. The thing that I always like to point out, and I feel a lot like the image to the left, is that this mosquito is actually an elephant mosquito. And these elephant mosquitoes don't actually feed on blood. And not only that, it's a male elephant mosquito. And so to have both things, so males typically don't feed on blood and elephant mosquitoes typically don't feed on blood. So it would be a long shot to try to get any dino DNA from that particular mosquito. So these are not mosquitoes, following with the theme of having scaled wings and a proboscis. You can see that this robber fly, even though it has a similar body shape, just isn't the same. It doesn't have that proboscis. And then this midge, again, the mouth parts are very clear there where you can see that. And it has very clear shiny wings, so you can tell that that's not a mosquito. Same thing with this crane fly, it does not have scaled wings. And if we were to get a different angle on that crane fly, we would also see that the mouth parts look very different. Mosquitoes, you can start to think of a little bit like aquatic organisms. So while the mosquito we're familiar with is just buzzing around our ear or flying around our heads, mosquitoes are very closely tied to water. Their eggs are always laid in or around water or in areas that tend to be flooded with water. So you can see this Culex species laying this raft of eggs on the surface of the water. An Anopheles mosquito on the bottom left lays eggs that have little flotation devices, little on the sides. That's what these little floaty pads on the left and right are. And then you've got this floodwater mosquito that has laid eggs along the rim, has formed a circle in this petri dish, where if you were to flood that petri dish with water, you would see these, you might see the eggs hatch and become larvae. The larvae are the baby mosquitoes, and sometimes they're called wrigglers. They develop in water. There aren't any mosquito larvae that develop outside of water. You can see this little tadpole may be used for comparison to compare to these mosquito larvae. Pupa, again, also develop in water, and some people call these tumblers, and you can see how they get that name from the action of them flicking their tail and rolling in a circle. So unlike a chrysalis and a butterfly, mosquito pupae are very active and they move around. Even the adults are associated with water to some extent. They emerge from water and they lay eggs in and near water. So they basically are aquatic organisms, even though they have this a small fraction of their life stage that we know them as is terrestrial. As larvae, they're going to be mostly feeding on microorganisms and detritus. So like broken up debris from like leaves or plant material. They're going to be feeding on algae, plankton, fungi, bacteria, or in the case of this mosquito down here on the bottom, the elephant mosquito. This mosquito, as a larva, feeds on other mosquitoes. You can see that giant mosquito larva feeding on all these other mosquito larvae. As an adult, this elephant mosquito only takes nectar. So you might think of it maybe as the coolest mosquito because it could pollinate as an adult and then it eats mosquitoes as a baby. All adult mosquitoes, with a very few exceptions, are nectar feeders, which means that they could be pollinators. And in the case of this one orchid called Platanthera obtusata, this is a mosquito pollinated, primarily a mosquito pollinated plant. There are some moths that will pollinate this plant, but it's mostly mosquito pollinated. So they could even be considered a pollinator to some extent. And with mosquitoes, it's only the females that feed on blood. So if you look at this Asian tiger mosquito, it's taking a blood meal now, and it's going to use that blood to then lay eggs later on. They need it for egg production. There are certain components of this blood that are very nutritious and assist in what we call vitellogenesis, or the development of yolk. In all life stages of mosquito are the food for other animals. So as young, they can be fed to dragonflies or food for fish. As adults, dragonflies might still be eating them. I promise that I'll keep these charts to a minimum, but this one I felt like very clearly demonstrated how beneficial certain mosquito larvae are to dragonflies. In this experiment, they had sprayed a compound called BTI. Now this is a compound that's not going to hurt dragonflies directly, but what they noticed is in the areas where they sprayed this compound heavily, there was a reduction in the number of dragonflies. And that's what these red arrows are pointing to, is the lower line represents that there were fewer dragonflies than the control site where there was no spraying. And this is not because this compound killed the dragonflies and damselflies. It's because this compound killed so many of the food source that the damselflies and dragonflies essentially starved to death. And so there are fewer of them around. When it comes to food for animals, a lot of times people like to bring up bats. The statement of bats is a little bit overstated. In this particular study put together by Griffin in 1960 is a little bit flawed. What they did is they starved the bats and they put them in, and then they put them in a room where the bats only had access to mosquitoes. And then they only let the bats eat for a very short period of time. And then they took that and they extrapolated it across an entire night. So it's kind of a lot of people kind of laugh at it as almost like a junk study. Now, there are a lot of other good reasons to like bats. I mean, they're cute, they're furry, they're a flying mammal for crying out loud. And so they're kind of cool for other reasons. And they do eat a lot of moths. But when it comes to mosquitoes, it's probably a little bit overstated. You can find mosquitoes in virtually every location on planet Earth with the exception of Antarctica. You can even find them as high up as the Arctic. So this is Toolik Field Station in Alaska. And you can just look at this photo on the left. Look at how many mosquitoes are flying around during that time. The Anopheles serengeti mosquito. This mosquito is found in the desert. So this is also referred to as the malaria desert mosquito. And so you can see, even though there are some areas of water around, this looks like most of the area is a very, very dry location. You can find mosquitoes on the tops of mountains. So this mosquito, Alclaricatus palutas, it can be found as high as 230 to 340 meters above sea level. So if you look at the diagram of the Central Alps, you can see that's in the alpine and snow zones is where you're going to find this mosquito. And there's even a mosquito, Wyomia smithii, that breeds inside pitcher plants. And this is the only location that you're going to find this mosquito. And you can see a close-up of that larva along with some eggs. One of the only places you don't find mosquitoes is Disney World. So in addition to Antarctica, you also don't find them in Disney World. And the reason for that is that in Disney, they have very, very good water management. Going back to the same theme where mosquitoes need water to survive. If you look at the Magic Kingdom, you've got these very sharp, narrow, steep steeples on the top of all these buildings. It looks pretty, but another reason why they have that is that it's also really good at letting water slough off the sides and not pool on any of the roofs. They also have really good drainage systems and really good management of trash in Disney World. So you're not going to find a lot of mosquitoes here. And this is all despite the fact that Disney World is built up inside a swamp. And right nearby, you have the Lake Marion Creek Wildlife Management Area. If you look at that photo on the right, that is a prime mosquito breeding habitat. And with Disney World just next door, you would have to wonder why they don't have it. It's really just all comes down to good water management. But mosquitoes are very, very diverse. In Massachusetts, we have over at least 51 species of mosquito. When you compare that to the number of terrestrial mammals, that had 67, you can understand that mosquitoes are incredibly diverse, and there are many more worldwide. So you look at this picture of Aedes albopictus, the Asian tiger mosquito on the left, and you can see this black and white pattern. Even a similarly related mosquito, Aedes canadensis, it doesn't have that black and white pattern. So some close-up images can really demonstrate how different mosquitoes can appear. And then Saurophora ferox and Anopheles quadrimaculatus. You even have some mosquitoes that might be considered maybe even beautiful or attractive. You've got Saurophora ferox that we brought up recently. This has this purplish sheen and these nice green eyes. And then you have the Toxorynchides species, the elephant mosquito, also has this iridescent kind of sheen to it. It's very, very attractive looking mosquito. So how did mosquitoes get to become the bad guys? Well, it wasn't always this way. And if you had stuck around since the tick presentation, you might remember that if you look back through history, hunter-gatherers experienced very few pathogens. There were very low infection rates, and we believe that this had a lot to do with the onset of agrarian or agricultural society about 40,000 years ago. We think that it had a lot to do with community living, especially in the case of viruses, which might confer a lifelong immunity. There might have needed to be about 20,000 or so individuals in order for those viruses to establish. We think it had a lot to do with pushing out normal animal hosts and then being brought in close contact with domesticated animals. So a lot of these factors where you might have had a virus that naturally circulated in animals, then jumped to people as we went about doing these types of behaviors. So these germs adapted to use what we call a vector. And a vector is just an animal that will pass on one disease from one animal to the next. And germs really like to use vectors because the outside environments can be very hostile. You have a lot of UV rays, you have wind, and a lot of things that are very hostile to these viruses. In the case of Triple E, the mosquitoes adapted to circulate the virus in birds. And so the mosquito for Triple E typically circulates the virus within and between birds. So even though this image of a mosquito is not the right species, I love the image of just kind of demonstrating how it passes from bird to bird. So for most viruses, the humans are dead-end hosts. The diseases don't actually want to end up in us. And that's even the case with triple E, Eastern Equine Encephalitis, doesn't want to be in people, and it doesn't want to be in horses either. It wants to circulate in birds. So very early in the season, we can see this virus amplify in animal and mosquitoes. So you can look at this mosquito species, Culiceta melanura, the black-tailed mosquito, is going to be mostly cycling this between different birds. The rodents and reptiles maybe a little bit, but mostly birds. This black-tailed mosquito is very interesting. It breeds in underground crypts. So if you look at this photo on the right, you can see these little mounds that might appear at the base of trees covered in this moss. That's actually the tree's roots. And this mosquito is very clever. It will actually get up, it will actually fly underneath the ground. There are little holes and little gaps in the soil where the mosquito will then fly into. And there's a little cavity underneath that tree, and that's where the mosquito will lay its eggs. So it's almost like protected bubble-like environment where the mosquito larvae develop underneath that tree. So that makes this mosquito very, very difficult to manage. You can't just go into this environment and spray around and expect to control those mosquitoes because they're going to be underneath the ground, underneath that tree. Later in the season, after this black-tailed mosquito has been cycling it throughout these birds, there are going to be many, many infected birds carrying this virus. And that's where the concept of a bridge vector comes into play. So something like maybe Cochleatidae perturbans might bite a bird, and now this mosquito doesn't just feed on birds, but it also feeds on things like people, horses, and other types of birds. So this is where you see that jump from it being cycled in birds to now it being passed on to humans and other animals. So what about this cattail mosquito? So this cattail mosquito lays its eggs near aquatic vegetation, and the larvae are also very difficult to manage. And that's because these larvae actually breathe through a siphon that's modified to stick into plants. So if you look at the left, you've got these mosquitoes kind of using their siphon. You can see this long tail that's kind of poking the surface, giving the mosquito oxygen. These mosquitoes, on the other hand, poke their tail into the plant tissue and breathe through the plant, so they're fully submerged underwater. Eastern equine encephalitis is not spread evenly throughout the United States. We see it high in populations in Florida, and we also see a little bit in the upper Midwest, but then in the Northeast, right around us. And if you look at Massachusetts, there are quite a large number of those colored in patches. We think that triple E starts each year in Florida and then makes its way north. So it doesn't exist year-round in Massachusetts. The only place it really seems to exist year-round is up in this panhandle of Florida. And they discovered that by looking at chickens. They would set out the chickens almost like a canary in a coal mine, and then test the chicken's blood and look for the virus in the chicken's blood. And that's where they found out that it exists year-round in Florida, but not in a location like Massachusetts. So if we're gonna get it this year, you can think it has made its way all the way up here from Florida. The cycle of triple E, it happens in like these 3-year bursts. And what we think that's at least what we predict based on the limited set of data that we have. So from 2004 to 2006, those were bad years. And then from 2010 to 2012 were another set of bad years. And now we're seeing that last year was a bad year. So I would expect this year in 2020 and 2021 for us also to see some pretty significant hits of triple E in mosquitoes. It seems like things are getting worse. So I'm sure you've heard by now about murder hornets, or you've heard about Lyme disease, or the cicadas, the emergence of cicadas in 2020. And maybe even you've heard about the locust swarms in Africa. So what the heck is going on? And let's focus a little bit on what might be going on with mosquitoes. So with mosquitoes, what we might be seeing is maybe the introduction of new diseases. So when we heard about Zika before, this is an introduced disease. It doesn't exist. It didn't exist in America. It was brought into this country. And same thing with West Nile virus. West Nile virus was actually brought into this country from Africa into New York. Or you've got the introduction of new organisms like this Asian tiger mosquito, which was imported from Asia. We also think that changing land use patterns might play a role, so changing the ecology around us, or increased human contact. So as we build our houses up into these nice suburban habitats, are we coming into contact with more mosquitoes by doing so? So on the record, I'm not allowed to say if climate change exists, but I do want to talk about some hypothetical scenarios if climate change existed. So if we had increasing temperatures, what would that do for mosquitoes? We might see increased or shorter reproduction cycles. So typically, mosquitoes might take a few weeks, maybe even some months. But if you look at the example of this mosquito Culex tarsalis, at 70 degrees Fahrenheit, it takes 14 days for this mosquito to go through a full life cycle. At 80 degrees Fahrenheit, it takes only 10 days for that mosquito to complete the same life cycle. Now, 14 days may not seem like a heck of a lot of time, but if you think about this over the course of an entire summer, that can amount to thousands of more individuals just by shaving off a few days. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on what exactly this is, but there's something called the extrinsic incubation period. What you can think of this is basically how long it takes a mosquito from consuming an infected blood meal to then becoming infectious and spreading that virus. It's not like a mosquito can just take infected blood and then bite something right away and spread that disease. It takes some time for that mosquito to become infectious. So in the case of West Nile virus, it takes the mosquito 15 days at 68 degrees Fahrenheit from consuming that blood contaminated with West Nile virus to becoming infectious. On the other hand, if you were to increase that temperature to 86 degrees Fahrenheit, that same mosquito taking that infected blood meal, it would only take 5 days to then become infectious. And we also see the impact that maybe warm weather species moving further north might have, like in the case of the Asian tiger mosquito, which is a subtropical or tropical species of mosquito now being found as far up as Massachusetts. So you might be finding more mosquitoes, they might be spreading infection more often, and you might find mosquitoes, different types of infections spread by different mosquitoes. So where do we go from here? If you can think about the way mosquitoes pass on disease, a little bit like a table, and that there are 3 legs to that table. And if you were to knock out any one of those legs, you might knock out that disease and you might not see that disease. So you have the pathogen. So for example, Eastern equine encephalitis, you have the vector. So in the case of a mosquito, like the cattail mosquito, and then you have a host, a human. So if you were to disrupt the relationship that any one of these things has, you could then mitigate disease. So in the case of the mosquito and the pathogen, you might try something like aerial sprays to really knock down that vector, and maybe that vector doesn't get that pathogen. Or you might have a vaccine so that even though there are a lot of infected mosquitoes flying around, the people just might not get that disease. Or the last relationship, and this is the relationship that I think is the most important, because this is the one that we have the most control over. This is whether or not the mosquito contacts the human. Even though that mosquito may be infectious, if you're preventing that infected mosquito from contacting a person, you can then prevent disease. And a large portion of that is going to be these repellents. So one of the ways you can do that, and this is probably the nerdiest way, but a really effective way is by using nets. So this is a head net right here. And I'll tell you this is incredibly effective. I like to do a lot of camping in Maine, like to do a lot of hiking in New Hampshire, and this net is a lifesaver. I keep one in my car at all times. You can also get this net, they also make nets to put over strollers to then protect babies, and the nets can be very, very effective. A lot of times people will ask me, what's a non-toxic way of preventing mosquito bites? Well, the nets is probably about the best you can get. You can limit activity. So this is not 100%. So I want to show you a diagram of certain types of, basically this is data from 2019 showing what types of mosquitoes were tested. And what they found in 2019 and this is not just a trend for 2019, but this is just some known information, is that the day-biting mosquitoes were a lot less infected with both Triple E and West Nile virus. So in the case of Triple E, the day-biting mosquitoes were only 34 pools of the total 428 pools of mosquitoes. And the night and twilight biting mosquitoes, there were 394 positive Triple E pools of the 428 pools in 2019. So that's just Triple E. And then for West Nile virus, there were 87 positive pools. One of those pools was day biters, but 86 were the night and twilight biters. So you can see that by limiting your activity to the daytime, you can reduce the chance that one of these infected mosquitoes is going to come in contact with you. But it's not going to ever really reduce it down to zero. So in that particular case, it's still always important to use repellents and to use other protective measures, even if it's the middle of the day. DEET is the most common repellent, so it's DEET, not DDT. And it's basically the gold standard. It's been tested, it's been used for about 60 years, 73 if you include the military. During that time, they estimate about 200 million people use it annually. And since about 1998, this was a study conducted in 2002, there were about over 8 billion human applications. So when you compare this to the number of deaths that have been reported with DEET, they've reported about 4 deaths associated with DEET. These were never confirmed. And after those billions and billions of applications, and not a confirmed death with DEET, DEET is about as squeaky clean safe as you can get. And then compare this to the fact that mosquitoes kill 1 million people per year, and even falling coconuts kill 150 people per year. DEET's about as safe as you can get. You weigh the cost and benefits to using DEET. But you do have other options. Maybe you just don't like the smell of DEET. Maybe you're just a hipster. I don't know. But you can use something called Picaridin or Icaridin. This is what's typically used in Europe. This is really what I like to use because it doesn't have that crazy smell that DEET has. Or this product IR3535. This is a product found in Avon Skin So Soft with Bug Guard. And then there are 2 at the bottom here, Oil of Lemon Eucalyptus and BioUD. The jury's still out on these. The CDC recommends them, but honestly, the data found in literature is just not that strong yet. So I would like to see a little bit more information on these before I would go ahead and make the recommendation. But they probably work. So how do mosquitoes find us? So a large portion of how mosquitoes find us is by using scent. So if you look at this mosquito at the top, going to point A and then B and then A again, and then these little gray squigglies would represent like maybe air currents and blowing CO2 downwind. So this mosquito is going to start downwind and it's going to actually fly into the wind up to A and then go up to B. And then if it loses the scent, it will do this zigzagging motion until it relocates that scent again back up to that second A. And then once it relocates that scent again, it's going to then again surge upwind. And it's going to do this until it locates an object. And then when it locates that object, it's going to fly into it, start using vision and other cues. If that object is not a human or not something that it wants to bite, it's going to then try to locate that scent by finding this downwind type of air current and eventually make its way to a person. And so if you had a way of blocking that mosquito from then navigating using all of this scent from finding you, then that would be an effective way at reducing bites. And that's exactly what these repellents hope to do. There's also treatments for cats and dogs, especially dogs, because dogs can get dog heartworm, but cats could even get it too. So it's really important that you protect your pets. I know these products look the same, but it's important that you follow the directions. One is made for small dogs and one is made for small cats. And then I want to talk a little bit about the 25B exempt products or the all-natural products. So with these, it's really important to recognize that there's no evidence of safety or efficacy, which means we don't know if these are safe or effective. In some cases, they may be no better than water. If you look at this bottle on the left, I could sell you this bottle and put lemonade in this, and there would be nothing illegal about that. They're just simply not regulated. But what we find is even in some of the products that work, they often don't last as long, or they don't protect as well. So they may only repel 30% of the mosquitoes. I'm just pulling that number out of the air, versus a DEET, which has been shown to repel, as much as 70 or 80% of mosquitoes. So these repellents just aren't as strong as some of the synthetic products. So it's a tough call. I do have some colleagues that tell me it's synthetic or bust, just tell them to use synthetic. But I have met people who are very adamant and they will tell me that, fine, I'm not going to use anything then. And I would rather people use something rather than nothing, even if that something is less effective. For myths, citronella candles, they don't really work. They're not acceptable levels of repellency. The mosquito bracelets, this one on the top, it used metafluorin. This one worked okay. It actually worked pretty darn well. And that's because this off bracelet, it emits a synthetic compound, a lot in the same class of compound to what they use in the aerial spray. So if you can think about this bracelet that you're wearing, maybe like a little bit of a fogger, you're gonna be fogging this compound around your body. That's gonna work really, really well. There's bracelets on the bottom, this one that looks like a little bit like a Live Strong band, and this sonic repeller, they don't work at all. So I would not waste your money on them. When it comes to finding mosquitoes, source reduction is really important. Again, people want to talk a little bit about using non-chemical ways of managing mosquitoes. One of the best ways you can manage mosquitoes is with source reduction. Most people think that the mosquitoes in their yard are coming from a nearby pond. If you look at this little girl fishing in this pond, it looks like this murky water, still water, stagnant water, would look like the perfect mosquito breeding habitat. And truth be told, there probably are a good number of mosquitoes in there. But in this natural pond setting, you have other things like dragonfly and damselfly larvae and fish. They're going to be eating these mosquitoes and naturally controlling those populations. Mosquitoes need only as much water as found in a bottle cap. And so what this means is that there are some locations where you're going to find dragonflies and damselfly larvae cannot live, and fish, but mosquito larvae can still exist. So when I look at this house, there may be no nearby pond at all, but I can look at all these different habitats and see them as potential mosquito breeding habitats. Mosquitoes only fly about 2 kilometers. Most mosquitoes only fly about 2 kilometers. There are some that can fly very, very long distances. But when you find mosquitoes, they're going to be found in these habitats that are close to your house. And just for reference, 2 kilometers is about 1.25 miles. So this bird bath, for instance, would be a perfect mosquito breeding habitat, and there wouldn't be any fish or dragonfly nymphs to control mosquitoes in that habitat. The potted plant tray, and even the gutters on the tops of your roof. Corrugated gutter systems are really good mosquito breeding habitats as well. You can look at this corrugated gutter. You can see all these leaves mashed up in there. This detritus might be an excellent food source for mosquitoes. And each one of those ridges might provide its own individual mosquito breeding habitat with no predators to control it. So one of the things you can do is remove these corrugated gutter systems and replace them with the image on the right, where the water just kind of flows down and hits this, this tray where the water is evenly distributed. Tires, really, really effective mosquito breeding habitats. This is actually an image from my own house. I found these tires when I bought this house buried in the ground behind my backyard. And tires are really excellent at breeding mosquitoes. They're black, they collect a lot of heat, and they retain that heat. And they're nice and protected. They collect water, they last forever. So tires are excellent mosquito breeding habitats. Trash, so what we find is really important, especially in urban environments, is that the trash buildup, a lot of disposable cups, plastic cups, styrofoam cups, mosquitoes are breeding in these and are able to sustain themselves even though there aren't any nearby natural water sources around those. Tree holes are another source, another location where mosquitoes can breed. If you look at this tree hole here, this is a special kind of mosquito, Ochlorotitis triceriatus, the tree hole mosquito, which breeds specifically in tree holes. So if you wanted to prevent this mosquito from breeding, one of the things you can do is to fill those holes. You want to use expanding foam, water-resistant expanding foam. This will allow that foam to kind of grow with that tree. You never want to use sand or gravel or cement. Those just are not effective. The cement is going to damage the tree. The sand or gravel is just not really going to work. The other thing you can do is to keep water moving. Mosquito larvae and pupa cannot survive in moving water. If you can't create a system like this, another thing you can do is to replace that water every week. I'm going to talk very briefly on mosquito sprays. And truth be told, the spray topic could honestly be its own webinar. But when it really comes down to it, spraying for mosquitoes, unlike ticks, is very temporary, and it's also highly variable. There are a lot of things to consider. So you might control on the order of days, maybe 5 days, maybe even less, maybe even a day, up to 6 weeks. And you might get 0% control depending on what species you're looking at, or you might get over 90% of control depending on what species you get. It depends on the product you use. It depends on where you spray it. There are a lot of things to consider. So just looking at one example of this particular study, what they found, if you look at this 80s Vexans, you had 988 over the 1,000 odd mosquitoes found at ground level. On the other hand, if you follow this kind of the red box down, you look at Culex pipiens, you had 358 found about 15.5 meters in the air. So you're looking at like tree canopy height, basically the height that birds fly at, and this is a bird biting mosquito. So you can see that the mosquitoes are orienting themselves very differently vertically. And so where you might apply that spray would impact different types of mosquitoes. One of the things that I would recommend is that if you're gonna get a spray, that you contact Plymouth County Mosquito Control Project. The first and foremost, most important thing is that this spray is free. Second thing that I would like to bring up is that there are trained professionals applying this. And the third thing is that they abide by certain restrictions that your private and contract operators aren't going to abide by. So they allow a wider berth when spraying near conservation land, for instance. The Mosquito Control Project will also spray up to 8 times per season. So this is not something that I would recommend as a way of knocking down and controlling mosquitoes year round. But if you were gonna say have a cookout and have a lot of people over, you might wanna call them, get this spray scheduled, and then they will come out and spray, and then that spray may protect your guests from mosquitoes for that weekend. If you're bitten, it's really important that you do not Google the symptoms. Like ticks, a lot of the mosquito-borne diseases have very generalized, nondescript symptoms, fever, headaches, those kinds of symptoms. So it's important to gather evidence and see a medical professional. And so the bottom line is that with the right knowledge and awareness, vector-borne diseases are preventable. And at this point, I'll take any questions. I also would like to mention that if you saw anything in this presentation and would like a citation for that, or would like some information regarding why I included it in this presentation, you can also feel free to email me.